This is Matthew Cratter from Trady University, and today I want to talk about the Bitcoin miners shutting down in Texas. I think this is a really interesting story that's been neglected by the mainstream press. Here's the article from Bloomberg, which we're going to talk about. Bitcoin miners shut down as Texas power grid nears brink. Almost all large Bitcoin miners have shut down as demand peaks. So in order to understand this story, we need to understand how the electric grid works in the U.S. Texas is actually on its own grid that's operated by a group you may have heard of called ERCOT, which stands for Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And they're the organization that manages the Texas interconnection, which is the AC grid that takes up most of Texas. We can see here that the U.S. and Canada are on these large grids. We have the Western interconnection. We have Texas down here doing their own thing. We have the Eastern interconnection, and then we have a couple smaller ones. It looks like we have a large one here with the Quebec interconnection. But these are grids, and it's important to realize that Texas does its own thing when it comes to the electric grid, as it does its own thing when it comes to so many things. And I think this is actually a very smart thing to do. It gives you flexibility, and it gives you more power when it comes to dealing with the federal government, and also in terms of setting your own policy. So Texas has its own grid. It's been this grid has been strained at various times. We had various outages, maybe it was a year ago during the winter. And now we're dealing with the grid, the Texas grid, trying to deal with the very, very hot weather and the huge electricity demand that comes from that, with everyone turning on their ACs, etc. Now, in order to understand this context, you have to understand that when you set up power generation, when you set up a grid, you need to optimize for uptime, redundancy, reliability. These are the kind of terms that you'll hear. And if you've ever lived in a place or visited a place that has rolling blackouts or brownouts, as I have, you know how annoying and destructive it can even be to your computer, to your productivity, not to mention the fact you might boil or freeze to death if it happens in the middle of the winter when there's a polar vortex, or in the middle of the summer when it's 120 degrees in Arizona or Texas. So it's very important, if you're going to have an advanced civilization, to have a grid that doesn't go down and wipe out your computer, turn off your AC, freeze your appliances, hurt your appliances, etc. And so what this means in practice is that most of the time you need to be able to produce, or at least be able to produce, more electricity than you actually need at the time. So what you do is you optimize for those electricity demand peaks, because you can't have the grid crashing right when everyone comes home from work and starts making dinner. People come home from work, they crank up their AC in the summer, they start cooking dinner, they start using the internet and streaming movies. This is when there's a lot of energy demand, electricity demand. If you have the grid crash at times like this, even if it goes down for a very short time, it can be devastating for various electronics, for critical infrastructure. You think utilities, other utilities, water, for example, sewage, general productivity of people, of human beings. If the internet goes down, if you can't run computers, this really freezes up a lot of people's productivity as well as leisure time. And then you have critical human infrastructure that we don't want to neglect. Babies on incubators, old people on various heart machines and breathing machines, hospital operating rooms, these kind of things where people will actually die if the electricity goes down for long enough, and if the building doesn't have generators. You can have a propane or natural gas or one of these generators. You can have even a very large generator for a hospital, but this isn't a long-term solution for mission critical infrastructure like data centers and like hospitals. They're too big to be run completely on generators. Maybe you can just run the operating room. So this is why it's important, if you want to have first world living standards, to have an electricity grid that doesn't go down. The downside to this is if you're constantly overproducing electricity, there is a lot of waste. For example, if you're firing up natural gas, it's difficult to turn these power generators on and off. There's certain costs to doing that, and they can't be turned off and on a dime. There's a process. Obviously, the same goes for nuclear. There's probably even a longer process to turn one on and turn one off. So this is the problem. You need to optimize your grid and your power generation for peak demand times, and yet you need a way to sop up the waste that's happening most of the time. So here's the question. What if you had an electricity customer, a consumer of electricity, that was willing to use all of that excess electricity most of the time, and then be willing to shut off at times of peak demand at 4 or 5 or 6 in the afternoon when everyone's coming home from work and turning on their ACs? This is really what happened with the Bitcoin miners in Texas. They voluntarily shut down. They were not shut down by any state decree, but they're trying to be good businesses, good citizens. And it's really no skin off of their back to do something like this. And this does encourage Texas to allow even more Bitcoin mining. And when you come to think of it, what other business, what other industry has this much short-term flexibility when it comes to the electric grid? Factories? No. Data centers? No. Hospitals? There's really no business or industry that I can think of. Bitcoin miners add enormous flexibility to the grid. They can turn off when the electricity is needed elsewhere. In demand, when they're negotiating their contracts with the power company, for example, all they really care about is low electricity rates most of the time. And in this way, they set a floor to electricity rates, which is great for power generators and grid operators. And they're also willing to turn off when electricity becomes too expensive. If it becomes too expensive versus Bitcoin's price, then they will shut off completely until the difficulty adjustment kicks in after 2 weeks and it's easier to mine Bitcoin, or until the price of those Bitcoin that they're earning goes up, or until there's a difficulty adjustment every 2 weeks, which makes it easier or more difficult, in this case, easier to mine Bitcoin. So this is a very, very flexible system. Bitcoin is a very flexible ecosystem, and it's good for human civilization, as we've demonstrated in this video. By contrast, data centers, hospitals, they need to keep drawing on this electricity under their contracts with the electrical companies, which means those electric companies need to buy electricity from elsewhere or figure out how to generate it, whether it's affordable for those power companies or not. So this flexibility that Bitcoin miners bring really cannot be overstated. We've talked about this in other videos. For example, we've talked about how some Bitcoin miners are using stranded natural gas that would otherwise just be flared into the atmosphere because there are no pipelines nearby. But Bitcoin mining in general is great for stranded energy. And you can think of all of Texas as almost being like this stranded energy island. But you can also have more locally stranded energy. For example, a hydro project maybe in the east of China or somewhere else. These tend to be a little further from human civilization and from cities. Stranded wind, stranded solar. You have a lot of this in Texas, especially West Texas, where there are not a lot of people living there, but you do have a lot of wind and a lot of sun. The problem with electricity, you may know, is you can only send it something like 500 miles, and you really lose a lot of the energy the further you try to send it. So it's a very, very local market. One of the nice things Bitcoin miners can do in addition is they can also help you monetize a project. So let's say you build a new electric power plant and you build it ahead of, maybe there's a new development, a new town being built or a new suburb being built. You need to have electricity before you put the houses in, but then you have this electric plant that's running and generating electricity, and there's no demand for it because the houses haven't been built. So what you can do is you can bring in some Bitcoin miners to make money while you are waiting for that electricity demand to come online and the houses and businesses and factories to be built up. So this is what's amazing about Bitcoin mining. Quite unlike any other kind of mining, like gold mining, for example, Bitcoin miners are portable, they're flexible, and they help to stabilize the electric grid, all at the same time, while securing the most important asset, this neutral form of money that's going to form the foundation of our new civilization. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.